Wendy Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Open Lands. I know I've seen a lot of you. So I decided I wasn't going to do a big whole presentation because I really want to get to A, your questions, and B, also I want to be able to talk with some of you afterwards. But I thought it would be valuable for me to hit some of the things that Cheryl didn't hit, so we aren't repeating our presentation. I think one of the things that's really critical for everybody to understand, and Cheryl and I are enjoying this part of our lives right now, which is that we go to the same sources of funding. So I don't want anybody leaving the room thinking that Cheryl's going to give you a better deal or I'm going to give you a better deal than the other. That's just not how it works. The process that you have to go through from this perspective really does come down to a number of check boxes. And you have to make sure that you check each one of those boxes. And that's really what Cheryl and I, Utah Open Lands and the Summit Land Conservancy are going to be doing for you as landowners. And then ultimately, as Cheryl pointed out, we do have that responsibility in perpetuity. I would also say to the comment that was made back here with respect to what happens if the family is no longer engaged in farming. You know, there's a piece of property that we protected back in 1997. And when we protected it, the landowner said this to me. I said, you know, gee, Jean, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to say to you, why did you go with land conservation, that communist plot, as opposed to development? You could have made a grundle of money. Well, Jean had worked through the Depression, and he brought fresh fruit and vegetables to the miners that were standing in the bread and sugar trucks lines. And, you know, he said to me, I'll tell you, Wendy, the reason I'm doing this is because you can't eat money. And I kind of think about that every time somebody says, well, what happens if we no longer have agriculture? If we no longer have agriculture, I think we're going to have a lot more serious problems. So I think that that's really important. The other thing that I want to point out is I really want to instill this. Utah Open Lands and the Summit Land Conservancy are not against private property rights. In fact, I would suggest to you that both of our organizations support private property rights in supporting the private property right to preserve your land. Think about it. How many different firms do you know that you could go to get your land developed? In fact, our planning and zoning laws are often geared towards development. But there aren't as many organizations that you can go to who can help you preserve your land if you want to provide for that flexibility into the future. I think some of the things that I wanted to highlight, just thinking about some of the stuff that Cheryl talked about. I mean, you look at that video and it really pulls at your heartstrings, right? And I think everybody can resonate with why it is they want to see this for the next generation. It's more than just your heart, and it's more than just your emotion. Because the top two reasons that people come to the state of Utah are its scenic beauty and its recreational opportunity. Your pastoral landscape in the Heber Valley is definitely part of that scenic value that people come. You know that. You know that's why you have a big part of your economy dedicated to tourism. And so from our perspective, yes, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of value to this, but it also is going to have long-term economic benefits for your city and for your county. Utah Open Lands actually got involved in preserving open space throughout the state of Utah. We started actually in the Summit County area as well back in 1990, but our second transaction was protecting Snake Creek Canyon right here in Wasatch County. We added 1,000 acres to Wasatch Mountain State Park through a fundraising effort that some of you who are in the audience today were involved in. So we've always seen this as being beautiful and wonderful and wanting to see it get protected. And it's one of the reasons that we worked really hard as the bonds were going forward to help educate people that basically if you have local dollars, the world opens up in terms of opportunity for you, in terms of being able to do a bargain sale conservation easement like Cheryl talked about. I think one of the things that's really important for everybody to understand is that there are various different funding sources out there. There are private foundations, there are private individuals, there are governmental entities. And as Cheryl kind of alluded to, each one of these entities is going to be looking for different things, but I can guarantee you the top two things that they are looking for is how much skin in the game does the landowner have, what percentage of the land value are they willing to contribute to make this happen, and does the local community have funding? Well, you have crossed a huge threshold in Midway and in Wasatch County by having those bonds. So that's a huge element right there. The NRCS is an organization, it's a Natural Resource Conservation Service, and through the Farm Bill, they actually have funding for what they call their agricultural land easement program. And they will fund up to 50%, and in some instances 75% of the value of your conservation easement. The applications for that funding tend to be ongoing, but right now there's a deadline of April 19th for NRCS. So you can see we're already starting into that moment of getting funding. When you look at private foundations, oftentimes, and Cheryl and I have been working on this with other projects that we're working on right now, the funding for private foundations, they want to start seeing applications in the first quarter of the new year. So I bring all of this up because we are at March 21st. And I want to go back to something that Cheryl said. If you love your land and you want to leave a legacy for the next generation, for the next Midway town folk, one of the things you have to really realize is this is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And there's going to be a line that you're going to have to start to get into and participate if you want to really be able to leverage the funding and get dollars for your conservation easement. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, which was touched on just briefly by Cheryl, was the income and estate tax incentives. So actually in, what was it, in 2007, they started to recognize that especially farmers and ranchers can't benefit from the conservation easement tax incentive as much as other individuals. So through a long process, in part a lot of work and advocacy from organizations like Utah Open Lands and Summit Land Conservancy and the National Land Trust Alliance, we actually were able to get a permanent tax incentive that if you are a qualifying farmer or rancher, not necessarily your land, so your land may be agriculture, but you have to be a qualifying farmer or rancher. If you're a qualifying farmer or rancher, you can take 100% of your adjusted gross income for up to 16 years against the value of your gift. So if you consider the example of gifting $1 million, so you look at the example that Cheryl gave, you had a $6 million figure, you bring it down to $5 million. If you're making $1 million contribution, over that 16 years, you could actually, if your adjusted gross income was, let's say, $50,000, you could actually use up to $800,000 of that gift against your adjusted gross income. For those who are not qualifying farmers or ranchers, you can use 50%, you get 50% of your adjusted gross income. So, did I say 100%? I'm sorry, let me go back. A farmer or rancher can take 100% of their adjusted gross income against the value of the gift. Others can take 50% of their adjusted gross income. One of the other things that's important to realize too, though, is also that there are estate tax incentives. And I'd like to say that we know that there's been some tax reform. How many people understand the tax reform that we've just gone through or have filled out their taxes? Okay, I didn't either, to be honest. Conservation easement tax contributions survived all of that. So this is still a tax incentive that you can utilize when you're working with your taxes. And there's another element, which is the estate taxes. In essence, if you look at the fact that the conservation easement, because it strips away the development value of the property, it actually lowers the value of your property. And that, when you pass it on to the next generation, means that you've got a lowered estate tax. But in addition to that, the Farm and Ranch Protection Act that was passed as part of the 1997 Taxpayer Relief Act actually added an additional 40% of raw land value that you could take against your estate taxes. So if you've got a piece of property that is protected, you actually have multiple benefits in terms of income tax deductions and estate tax deductions. All of this is to say that it helps when you're working with a land trust to be able to look at these values and say, yes, I can contribute 25% of the value of the conservation easement, which helps the fundraising, which helps leverage dollars, and which actually sends a big message to the funders that this landowner cares about preserving their land. The other element with respect to estate taxes is that there's what they call a post-mortem election. So actually for up to 15 months after someone has passed, you can work to do a conservation easement and get out of some of the estate taxes that you're faced with. Because one of the things that I found when I started working with Utah Open Lands that was really, really tough to see is that these landowners ended up losing bits and pieces of their land over time because they had to sell parts of it to pay estate taxes when one of the individuals in the partnership that was part of the farming entity passed away. A conservation easement can help you keep that land together. I think one of the things we want to get to is obviously some of your questions and moving forward. There are a couple of other things that I just wanted to add. As far as kind of the process that you go through, as Cheryl alluded to, not every piece of property is going to meet the standards that it has to meet in order to qualify for these tax deductions, these benefits, and work with the conservation values that Utah Open Lands and Summit Land Conservancy are bound by. That's okay. I think it still makes sense for you to fill out a notice of interest application for Midway because you never know. But I mention that because it is a process that you have to go through. And your land may be beautiful, it may be wonderful, it may have all of these agricultural attributes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to pass the tests that we need it to pass in order to get these funds, in order to leverage some of these dollars, or in order to qualify for estate tax consequences. And so the sooner you at least ask the question of your family and of the land trust, hey, is this something that we want to do? The sooner we're actually going to be able to move to that point of whether or not this is a piece of property that actually can be protected. And I want to share with you, a story that I had from a landowning family. And first of all, they were two brothers and they didn't get along at all. Nobody has those problems. We all have great sibling relationships, I'm sure. And I remember the one landowner, I met with him several times to work on preserving his property, and when I finally met the other landowner, he said, "So did my brother tell you I had horns?" And I said, "No, he didn't tell me you had horns." And the reason I bring that up is because what was interesting to me is as much contention as they may have had within their family dynamic, the one thing that they were able to resolve and come together on was that at the end of the day, putting their land under a conservation easement and gaining a portion of value for that conservation easement was the most fair solution that they could come to for their family, because one part of the family really wanted to see the land protected and wanted to continue to farm that property in perpetuity. The last thing I would say is that this doesn't work for everybody. And I would be the last person to stand up here and tell you this is for you. If you love your land and you want to pass it on to the next generation, there are many different tools and there are many different ways that you can form a partnership and make that happen. But it's okay if it doesn't work for you. These are just options for you as a private property owner to explore in terms of what you might be contemplating for the next generation. Because there's one thing that I absolutely have seen, and that is that development does lock in the fate of the land. Because once it's developed, it will never become a productive farm field again. So with that, I am going to stop my presentation and allow for questions, and maybe Cheryl can come up and Cortland, and I don't know if you, and you can ask questions of us. Unless that was just so riveting that you're all good and done.
So you've been talking about putting an easement on a whole piece of land. Let's say I have 25 acres that I want to do an easement on, but I have 3 kids that I maybe want to let them build a house in the future on that land. Is that possible? And how does that affect the easement?
Yes, that is possible. So everybody, I'm sure, heard the question, but in essence, one of the things that we deal with all of the time is landowners say, I don't want to subdivide my property into small cookie cutter subdivisions of 1/3 of an acre or 1/4 of an acre, that sort of thing. But I do have a family and I want them to be able to live on the property and enjoy the property. So absolutely, there is a lot of flexibility that can be built into the conservation easement document. There are some things that we have to make sure it says certain things, but when it comes to the permitted uses on the property, there is a lot of flexibility, so long as, one, it doesn't compromise the conservation value. So if you're protecting a piece of property because it's this incredible scenic view and you want to put all of the houses right on the view corridor, then you're going to be compromising the conservation values. But that's one of the things we determine in the visioning process, is how we're going to move that around. The second thing, and something that I think landowners need to be aware of, is that does change the valuation. So there's something that they talk about, and I'm not going to get into it because it's all appraisal lingo. But the bottom line is that to the extent you retain development rights, that diminishes what you're giving up, and therefore the conservation easement value is going to be less. So when Cheryl showed that screen with the 50 to the 80%, that's what we're starting to talk about, is that fair market value of the fee title is diminished by what you end up holding as reserved rights, because those have a value to you. And that's recognized as something that you could sell, even if your kids, if that was intended for your kids.
There's another question here.
Let's suppose that you've got a trail that's a valuable trail, and you say you retain the ownership to it, and you put a conservation easement on it. But if you open it up to public access, and you retain fee, you now have a lot of liability. Or is there some way to shed that liability through this process? Example, the thing that first comes to mind to me is the Nature Conservancy's access on Silver Creek up in Idaho. A lot of fishermen all of a sudden come in there, right? That's part of the conservation. Somebody drowns, family sues, who's responsible?
I think that's a great question. I know Kate Southmeyer is here. We might want to bring her up. There are a couple of things. First and foremost, actually, there was a law passed back in the late 80s, basically to say that if you're a landowner and you open up your land for public recreation, you'll actually have the state come as your first line of defense. And we actually found this because we have a campground down in Moab, and we were facing kind of that same thing. And what we were told is actually if we put up no trespassing signs on the places where we don't want people to go that aren't part of a campground, we actually end up having more liability. So that's one of the things to look at, right? Yeah. Because if you think about ski areas and skiing, and there's a lot that's been done in the state with respect to recreational liability to limit that for landowners who want to provide public access to their property. But
you said it as a state law protection, I can't quite remember. But once I have more information, I actually have a handout for you that I'm happy to share with you. Once people read that, they kind of answers most of the questions.
It's a very good question, and really, if somebody comes on the property and falls over their skis and hurts themselves or something, you're not liable unless you dug a tiger trap and they fell in. So something that you did was really negligent, but in general, you're not liable.
Other questions?
What if there is an existing easement? An example here is Midway irrigation. What impact does that have on this whole situation?
So anything that's on title prior to the placing of the conservation easement is protected because it's, it goes in order of how now I feel like a rock star.
start singing, girlfriend.
No, you're the singer. So those easements would have to, are still in place. Lots of times we see utility easements and things like that. There is a lot of title work that goes into placing these conservation easements. We want to make sure that the land really is owned by the person who is looking to place a conservation easement on it. If there are mortgages on the property, in general, those have to be removed before the easement gets placed because the value is going to diminish when the easement is placed. And so the bank that is holding, this as collateral is gonna want some assurances that that loan is paid off. So does that answer your question?
Well, can they object to your easement, this environmental easement, this, like the utility company? Because they have a prior easement in the middle of that land?
They still have the right to do whatever they want,
Yeah.
whatever their easement, so they don't need to object to it.
Yeah, I mean, assuming they don't have the exclusive right, most utility easements, it's not an exclusive, it's just a, once in a while, right to come on and work on the utility lines. So usually those things play out quite well together. It's usually not a problem, but it's something you definitely read the title documents behind that to make sure it's okay.
We have found actually that utility companies will come in and, do some work on the underground utility on property, and then they do a really great restoration afterwards because of the conservation easement. 'Cause they have to.
One of the things that I just mentioned about the title work that is really important is we can't stress enough the fact that you have to do title work, you should do it early, and the bottom line is there are some showstoppers. So for example, if that utility easement, kind of as Kate was explaining, if that utility easement gives that utility company carte blanche access and ability to do whatever they deem fit based on what that easement has been written, and it threatens the potential conservation values, then we as a land trust from our due diligence perspective are going to have to say, unless we can narrow the scope of that easement, it may not work, because that is a potential issue that's going to be out there all the time, even if we know that they only have this corridor that they're working on. So it's really important to look at all of those easement documents, because they are superior to the easement unless we get them subordinated either through the mortgage issue, or sometimes utilities, we've had situations where the utilities have said, this is actually a great thing, we'd like to see this land protected, and therefore we're going to narrow the scope of our easement. But that doesn't happen often, does it?
What about eminent domain?
Okay, well, I'm going to start, and I'll hand it over to Kate, because we've had experience with eminent domain. So conservation easements are not safe from eminent domain. However, eminent domain has to prove that the public purpose for which they're condemning the property is higher than the public purpose for which it is already being used. The conservation easement is a public purpose. It is a value. And so we actually fought UDOT on the condemnation of a farm, in part because there were other corridors, there were other routes, and in fact, as we found and we proved on our particular piece of property, the route that they had established was less safe than the alternative routes by going through this actual particular property. But yes, conservation easements are not safe from eminent domain. However, the land trust is something that we look at, because the land trust does have to defend these conservation easements in perpetuity, and we would be looking to prove that the public purpose for which the property is already in use and protected is higher than whatever that eminent domain public purpose is. But that would end up most likely in court.
I have a question.
You got it, I haven't done it,
Oh,
you've done it.
excuse me. If you enter into this trust and you get all those tax advantages and you sell that piece of property, are those tax advantages transferred to the new owner?
No, because you got paid for them, and you took the tax advantages. The new owner is going to buy it from you generally at a lower value. So it's between you and the land trust and the property that you, and so you get the tax advantage.
But those tax advantages could be over a 15-year span,
That's right.
but they don't get, so
No,
if you only hold
because
it
they
for 2 years, then it's
Right,
done.
they didn't give a donation. You gave the donation. Yeah.
Katie, did you have something?
No, I was just going to comment on the earlier question about a prior easement, and if you then wanted to do a confirmation easement, if it would be a problem, and I was just going to comment that the only time it would be a problem is if the conservation easement was going to interfere with the rights that were protected by the utility easement or something like that. But I think Wendy addressed it by saying that usually a conservation easement, a development coming in could interfere with it and be a problem, but conservation probably wouldn't usually. In fact, it would be the other way around. In doing a conservation easement, you might be more worried about what the prior easement was doing.
I'm just going to ask a clarification of that tax question a little bit. You earned that credit in the year that you created the easement. So even though you sold the property, let's say 3 years down the road, you still, as long as you're alive, can continue to write off that gift over the 15 years.
Underline didn't mean as long as you're alive.
Yeah, you don't have to. Again, you don't have any income right now.
Look at the incentive for staying around.
So yeah, barn and fences, who takes care of those?
The landowner.
Okay.
The landowner still maintains the fences, you can't let it go to weeds, can continue to use the property as they've been using it for agriculture. It is still the landowner's responsibility. You still own it.
So what if we want it just for 15, 20 years till we're gone, kids don't want it, so then you can have 100% of it, then what happens? Who does the upkeep then?
You mean you want to give fee title to us?
Yeah, after we're done.
Well, that creates an interesting problem, because you don't want to have the same entity hold the easement who owns, as also owns the land. Because basically then what happens is you got the fox guarding the hen house, right? So you want some separation. I like foxes.
I was gonna say, in that analogy, which are you?
So you want to have a separation. So if there was a situation where that was happening, what the Summit Land Conservancy would do would probably look to find somebody else to either hold fee title to the property, or we might figure out a way to make it a preserve or something like that. But or maybe we'd partner with Utah Open Lands or another organization. I know Utah Open Lands even holds conservation easements over the Swanner Nature Preserve, the big Swanner Nature Preserve, because they want that extra level of protection, that it's not just one entity, because one entity might say, hey, we need a little money, maybe we should sell off a corner for something like that. So
I think one thing to add to that is really important is, and again, it goes under the category of doesn't happen overnight. Because there's a lot of visioning that goes into this process. What we have found, and just to give you a story, we protected a piece of property. It was an agricultural piece of property. A landowner passed away. He had no heirs. He had intended it to go to his nieces and nephews, but there was a big bad other entity that came along and said, no, it's us. It was a bank. And it wasn't a mortgage. It just said, no, we feel that it was in our trust and everything. The family went through a lawsuit. It was not fun. And that property was there for 11 years. We continued to monitor it. We continued to see it protected. And it was such a focal point for the community. And I gotta believe that here in Midway, having passed a bond for $5 million, and what Midway is all about, that its open spaces are never gonna be something that people wanna take for granted. That land is now owned by Salt Lake County. It is the mainstay. It is where the people in the neighborhood go, in the community go, and it supports 2 community-supported agricultural pursuits right now, and it is also now being incorporated into the New Roots program to allow refugee farmers to be able to farm there. So there's oftentimes a way for the land to continue to be protected, for the barns to be upkept, all of those sorts of things, but it's part of the visioning that we try to do at the very beginning.